Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, as we're joining and people are logging in, go ahead and let us know your name and where you're joining us from. Today, we will be going over Adlerian psychotherapy and counseling. This is a theory that is near and dear to my heart. But yeah, go ahead, jump into the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from and your name, and we'll get started in just 1 minute. We got Sarah from Santa Maria, Jen from California. Wow, Senna from Ghana, San Diego, Carolinas. Oh my goodness, Alliant, Oregon, LA, Buda, Texas, Orange County, Wow, okay. CSUN, oh my goodness, awesome. I used to teach there. San Diego Alliant, someone else from Santa Maria. Okay, Santa Maria's here. Florida, Irvine, LA. Got the West Coast here in the US, Scottsdale, Glendale, Colton, Turkey. Wonderful. Hi, Elif. She was in one of my classes. Good to have you here. It's been a while. Awesome. Tyler from Orange County. Awesome, awesome. So great to have you all here. Jennifer said, I had you for couples at CSUN. I think I only taught that twice. Oh my God, Jennifer, you must have graduated years ago. Great to have you here. Olympia, awesome, awesome. Ari from Israel, love it. Love it, love it. Okay, so Jennifer was in my class in 2012. Awesome. Great to have you here. Chicago School, love it. Here in LA, I know many of your faculty, and I did the commencement address at the Chicago School a couple of years ago. Wonderful. So great to have you all here. Sorry if I didn't miss Vermont. Love it, love it. Okay, a friend. Okay, Sacramento Alliant. Alliant is showing up in good numbers as well. Okay, so welcome everyone. Great to have you here. So today we'll be going over Adlerian psychotherapy. And I'm half Austrian, if you didn't know that. And so my dad actually grew up in Vienna, where Freud and Jung and Adler were all from, and kind of the birthplace of psychotherapy. So it's kind of been fun, and even family therapy. Paul Václavic was Viennese, several other of the founders in family therapy. So I think it's kind of weird that I ended up doing this. So here we are. But of all the founders of the field from the late 1800s, Adler was, I wish I could have known him, certainly a huge fan. So let's go ahead and jump in. So this lecture is designed to go with my two counseling books. I have Theory and Treatment Planning and Counseling and Psychotherapy. I also have a book called Case Documentation. And I do have two textbooks in family therapy as well. You can check all those out. And if you haven't found my resources page, if you scan this QR code, you go to therapythatworksinstitute.com/books. Shortly down the page, you'll see a form where you can put in your name. Let me know if you're a professor versus a student, and you can get access to all of the clinical documentation for all four of those books. And I'll let you know if you join that, if you're a student versus faculty, when those forms get updated as well. So please help yourself there. There are almost 50 free forms or case conceptualizations, which are probably the most useful thing for those of you still in graduate school. Or taking licensing exams. Don't forget to download those for your licensing exams. And there are also clinical forms like progress notes and clinical assessments and such as well, which I know the licensed people really like. So something for everyone there for sure. And for those of you who are graduate students, your university, and if your university requires you to do live trainings and they will accept a letter of attendance versus a CEU certificate, at the end, anyone here can get a letter of attendance. It doesn't count for CEs for most state licensing boards, but for many graduate programs will accept these as your advanced training for the semester. So you do need to be live to get those. So if you're watching this on YouTube after it's been recorded, I'm so sorry, but you can always go to my webpage, therapythatworksinstitute.com/YouTube live. and sign up for the upcoming ones. And so we'll be putting the schedule up for the rest of the fall shortly. Okay, so let's jump in and into talking about Adlerian psychotherapy. So, like I said, Adler was a contemporary of Freud and Jung. They all hung out together. I've gone to the cafes where they used to go, Café Landmant. If you would like, if you ever get to Vienna, you should definitely do a tour of where all of the, original founders of the field. And in the beginning, they were all talking and they were all friends. That didn't last long. They did separate. But what's really interesting about Adler, I really consider him really the founder, and his ideas are you'll hear and see these in most modern forms of psychotherapy. So I think at the end of the day, when you look at Freud, Jung, and Adler, Adler's ideas are really are what we see the most of when we move into the 21st century. And yet he doesn't seem to get enough credit. So I consider him the unsung hero of psychotherapy. Certainly, Adlerian therapy is still practiced today, but he is someone who I don't think gets enough credit for his contributions to the field. It's like everyone talks about Freud, but what Adler was doing in the late 1800s certainly I think is more relevant today. Is the most relevant. They're all relevant, but I really think Adler was just way ahead of his time. And so if you do have questions, you can go ahead and put them. Do I have it in the Q&A section? And I will answer those at the end if you're attending live. I will answer those at the end of today's workshop. Okay. So I'll keep going. Oh, here we go. Whoopsie. And so when you look at his work, I think arguably he's really one of the first people to look at subjective or phenomenological approach. So we know that the, Carl Rogers and the humanists get a lot of credit for that, but Adler was already working in a more subjective way, which is interesting. And he also, arguably gets a lot of credit for the first person to kind of think, looking at social systems, working systemically. So he really, all I can say is every time I sit down, I go through his work, I'm like, he really was ahead of his time. There was, uh, it's really incredible what he was doing in the late 1800s. And as we go through this, I think you'll just see so many links with what we do today. And his ideas have definitely been applied to both group counseling and the field of education as well. So if you're familiar with my unifying framework for psychotherapy, so basically it's a unifying framework that you can put all the different theories into, and there are four main levels: behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and societal narratives. And each theory and each level has a couple different elements to it. So when we look at Adlerian and what it primarily is looking at, it is primarily a cognitive approach. We're going to be talking about basic mistakes and the psychodynamic formulation. Basic mistakes are like cognitive therapy, over 50 years, I think, before cognitive therapy was a thing, maybe 70 years. I haven't done the math on that. But so it's just fascinating how he describes some of this. And he also gets into the identity narrative and these self-concept statements. So it's really interesting because normally this is narrative therapy. So this is late 20th century, but 100 years earlier, Adler really was talking about something similar. It's really fascinating. And then he does get into some of the primary attachment needs we'll talk about inferiority. If you've heard of an inferiority complex, that comes straight out of Adlerian therapy, and the family constellation. So looking at some of those things. So he's really, when you compare him across all the different possible ways of working, the focus is mainly going to be cognitive interventions and conceptualizations, with some work in the attachment area. Just this template just allows you to kind of compare and contrast theories across the board. Okay. Great. Okay. So I was just checking the comments there. Sorry about that. So in a nutshell, what is the least you need to know about Adler's approach? So the first is it is a holistic view. So he really looked at people holistically, including their context. And this is what is so revolutionary and really what distinguishes him so much from both Freud and Jung at the time. It's a very holistic view looking at people in context. He looks at social factors far more than anyone almost for a decade, for almost for a century after he started. But he really looks at these social factors, again, way ahead of his time in the late 1800s. And he focuses on free will choice. And so here you're kind of getting a theme and foreshadowing of the work of existentialists as well, but this free will choice. He looks at social motivation and how we are all motivated socially. There is this teleological and goal oriented. So he's looking at how humans, we are driven by goals and to pursue goals. And that's that motivation is really important, in understanding that is critical, in the practice of psychotherapy, because we're really in the business of getting people to change. And if you haven't noticed already, most of us humans are funny. There's a part of us that really wants to change, and there's a part of us that really resists change, even when we really want it. Shifting any homeostasis is painful for most of us, and so we have this kind of push and pull within us, and that's something I think all psychotherapists and counselors need to be looking at. Like I said, he focuses on the subjective reality and phenomenological. So we give so much credit, I think, to Carl Rogers for, starting the humanistic movement. But, Adler really was the first one to be looking at this subjective reality, the phenomenological experience of humans. And then there's this other thing you're going to hear a lot of. The term is, I think, doesn't translate great into 21st century language. So you have to kind of understand what he means by a style of life or a lifestyle. So we all have certain connotations, and that has certain meanings in everyday world. But in Adlerian therapy, style of life is really this characteristic set of attitudes and assumptions that helps a person make sense of life. So, this reminds me more of like a schema in more contemporary cognitive therapy. So he calls it a style of life. And I retain that. I haven't heard of anyone in the 21st century changing that out, but it's your kind of schema for looking at life, your default assumptions, the filter, the lens through which you look at life, right? So this is what he means by lifestyle. It's a very unique use of the term. And so, or style of life. And so that it's kind of, it goes down to core beliefs and the lens that you use to interpret the world around you. So let's look at what I call the juice, which are significant contributions to the field. And in all my books, I talk about the juice. And the idea here is, and this really comes from when I started writing textbooks. I'm like, okay, every theory I put into a book is significant. It has risen to the top of the pile of 500 of theories that we have, because there's something really useful that this theory does. And so I try to highlight that in the juice. So I know most of us are trained to pick one theory and really get good at it. And sometimes well, not sometimes, often there's a lot of putting down other different schools of psychotherapy or counseling. And that always, I don't think is in our best interest or our client's best interest. And so I invite you to have an attitude of whatever theory you're learning about, to find the juice, to find what is so significant here, that it has been practiced in this case over 2 decades or 2 centuries. Wow. Um, so Adler, the juice to me for Adler is this idea of what he calls social interest and community feeling. And so he talks a lot about how important it is to have social interest, meaning to have a sense of having something in common with other people, being part of a community, and benefits, you're cooperating with your community, that benefits you, that benefits others. And so since Adler's time, there has been so much research about how humans, we are wired to connect. We need the security, right? The emotional security that we get from community, from safe relationships. And that having a network, to having a social life that is rich and fulfilling is so important to our mental health. And we are just wired, we are social creatures. I like to joke that we're herd animals, but we need a community, we need connection. When we look at the global mental health epidemic that people talk so much about, 13% of the population has a mental health disorder at any given time somewhere, around the globe. The rates in the United States, 75% of youth have a mental health disorder by the time they reach 18. And a lot of this, people are realizing, is coming down to our loss of social connection, right? There's a loss of social skills with so much interaction over the internet that's been measured. That's not just an opinion, that, social skills are taking longer for people to develop because there's less face-to-face, especially during the pandemic. Um, but our communities are also more fragmented. Politically, we are more divided. Socially, we're more divided. In all of this, really, we can see it in the sense of isolation um, that youth are reporting. And so youth and adults, there's just isolation, increased sense of loneliness and isolation all across the lifespan in many, many, many countries around the globe. And this is significant, and certainly the pandemic accelerated it, the internet, social media, ironically, paradoxically, depending how you think about it, accelerated this. And so it's so interesting at this time in history to go back and visit. Adler's premise is that we are social creatures, and to feel mentally, emotionally well, we need to have strong social bonds. And that's really one of the main things that his approach looks at. And so he also talks about social interest, which is a willingness to give more to the community than one receives in return. And I did recently see a fascinating research study that was talking about how one of the best cures for depression, or one of the best treatments or things that helped improve depression the most, was doing nice things, random acts of kindness for other people. Like, we do all this psychological work, and it was a fascinating research study where they kind of compared some of the traditional, more cognitive behavioral interventions to do random acts of kindness, and the mood. Doing random acts of kindness for others, giving to others, actually gives us a lot psychologically in return. And in one research study was more helpful than traditional psychotherapy. Gives you a lot to think about. So when he talks about social life, he's talking about community life, he's talking about work, love relationships, romantic relationships, self-acceptance. So even, with yourself, a relationship with yourself, spirituality with something greater than yourself, and parenting. So that is if you have children, parenting your children. But these were the 6 areas, the primary areas of social life that Adler looked at and conceptualized when he was looking at style of life and social interest. That it's not just in one area. It's not just that you have a community you feel like you belong to. It's looking at your work life, your romantic life, your relationship with yourself, with God, and your own children. It's really interesting. I just this morning read a study on saying that, and it was specific to Gen Z, that 27% of them are wanting to actually move into work environments where they have more social interaction, and out of kind of working from home where you're more socially isolated. So there's this interesting shift that is happening where people are realizing that, especially if they're single, they don't have families or children, that there you get a lot of out of going to work and having a community there. So it is fascinating. I'm just having a fun time reviewing Adler at this time in history. So he used the goal of perfection. I don't know if I like that term so much, since we have a lot of perfectionism going on, and that's not always, a useful term. But what he meant by this was becoming your best self in each area, each of these 6 areas. So the goal was to not just get rid of depression or anxiety, but to really help you thrive in all 6 areas of life. And he also talked about how one of the, there's this concept of personal superiority where we're trying to be better than others. And that, as we're going to talk about as we go through this, can lead to some issues. So, so, so we have this kind of ideal strength that you're moving towards, but then we have On the other half of that, Adler talked about what prevents most of us from really thriving in all six areas and really developing social interest in a positive sense is this sense of individual inferiority. So that can include biological inferiority. It can include what he calls cosmic inferiority. And by that, he's actually talking existential. It's kind of an interesting term. I try to use the terms that were originally used, but that is just realizing how kind of, if you think of looking up at the night sky, if you've ever had that sense of, oh my God, I'm just a little speck in this grand universe. That's kind of what he meant by cosmic inferiority, but realizing we are finite in terms of how long we're on the planet. When you look at the really big cosmic picture, we are kind of small. But it's the personal inferiority was what he really focused the most on, is that a sense that we are somehow less than others in our social world, and that's where a lot of our symptoms and problems come from. This is also where the term inferiority complex comes from, which are patterns of striving for significance as a result of feeling inferior. So this is just, because you feel, I don't know, maybe you had a sibling who got better grades than you, right? So you have this inferiority complex in the sense that you always feel like you're not quite smart enough, and this pattern can follow you across your life. Or another sibling got a lot of attention for physical beauty, or physical looks or physical strength, right? That's kind of the biological inferiority. So you're going to try to spend your whole life trying to counter that narrative. And so he's looking at these themes, these beliefs about yourself, or what he calls a basic mistake, that inform this inferiority complex, which he believes was at the root of mental health issues. So very briefly, we'll talk a little bit of some of the main founders. So like I said, that Alfred Adler was a contemporary of Freud in Vienna. They worked together there along with Jung. But where he really differed from Freud, and it was major distinction here, is that Adler really believed the social realm was as important as the inner world. And so Freud really focused on the inner world, and even Jung focused on the inner world. And Adler was really distinct from those two, saying, no, 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 the social world is as important as that inner world. And I think that really does align with a lot of our beliefs today in terms of contemporary practice. So I really see him as a really revolutionary thinker for his time. And then his probably most famous student is Rudolf Dreikurs, who was a student, and Dreikurs is the one who really brought Adlerian theory to the United States. And so many of us here in the States associate this approach with Dreikurs. So let's look at the big picture and overview of the counseling process in Adlerian therapy. So Adler conceptualized treatment as having four distinct stages. The first is establishing an egalitarian relationship. So I just want you to pause and think about this. He is a contemporary of Freud, who really had one-way relationships. The therapist was this very blank slate, not a lot of interaction. And this concept of an egalitarian relationship in the late 1800s is really mind-blowing. It really is. He's just so ahead of his time, is all I can say. So, but that's a concept of Adler. Phase two is the assessment phase, which is assessing what the quote unquote lifestyle and private logic. So understanding how the client makes sense of their world. And if you are familiar with my unifying framework, I talk a lot about stepping into the client's world and understanding and interpreting the world. Talk about going into their holodeck, which is basically stepping into their world and trying to understand it from within their own unique private logic. And so it's really fascinating here to see Adler talking about a very similar process that I use to kind of teach my unifying framework. Phase three is encouraging insight and self-understanding. And so this is helping the client understand their world, and of course, insight, kind of that is a very familiar word with psychodynamic types of approaches, but really helping the client understand themselves, why they see the world the way they do, what are their basic mistakes, and trying to fix that. And then that's the phase four is educating and reorienting. So helping them, gain the insight and then put it into action. So these are the four basic phases of Adlerian counseling and psychotherapy. So let's look at this relationship in Adlerian therapy. So, like I said, the first thing is that it is egalitarian. And so by that, what we mean is he doesn't see the therapist as having a hierarchical, as a hierarchical relationship. It's more of a partnership between two people. And so again, very revolutionary for the time that he came up with those ideas, because I think in the 21st century, I think, seeing the relationship as a partnership is a really much more common. And he uses an interesting term, which is of encouragement. And this really kind of counterbalances this sense of inferiority. There is this wanting to really encourage clients. And you don't see this term used a lot in the field of counseling and psychotherapy, but he really saw his primary job, or the primary quality or sense of the relationship, is to encourage clients to become their best selves. So encouragement is a unique term, I think, to Adlerian approach. Of course, they talk about empathy and social interest. So having empathy for the client, being interested, having that social interest, that connection. So there's a warmth to these relationships, but still being directive. So even though it's egalitarian, there's still a directiveness in terms of giving really clear guidance of how to take action in the world. Now let's look at the viewing case conceptualization in Adlerian therapy. So the main part of case conceptualization in this approach is what they call lifestyle assessment. And so lifestyle, like I said, it's kind of a strange term, but it's just looking at your style of life, but it's looking at how you approach life, right? So the first thing they're going to look at is, how did your parents parent you? So this kind of goes back to some attachment, but what did you learn in terms of your worth, how to show affection, do you matter, those sorts of things. So they're going to look at how your parents parented you, and how that affected how you see yourself and make sense of life. They look next at family constellation and birth order. So the family constellation is, who are the parents, who are the main players. And one of the things Adler was one of the, I guess, first people to really look at is birth order. And so now there's been mixed results with research over the years. How much does birth order affect a person? And it's not a total one-to-one correlation prediction, but typically the oldest child, as you know, probably the stereotype is they tend to be leaders. They tend to be, to have this strength and confidence, where oftentimes the second or middle children often can feel lost in the family. They can feel less than, trying to prove themselves. Oftentimes the second or middle children will, actually, whatever the first child was into, they often will, do something polar opposite to create a niche for themselves. So if one's really athletic, the next one might be very academic, or vice versa. So excelling in different areas of life, and looking at that with the youngest, as you probably know, the youngest is often seen as being the most babied and nurtured, expecting a lot of nurturing. Can often be very comical or entertaining the family, as the youngest child is their way of getting attention. So, and with only children, again, being more like a firstborn child, and also potentially, and again, I've seen research in both ways, so I'm kind of slow to nail these down, but tending to be more self-focused, not knowing how to share, are some of the stereotypes. May or may not be true for you, your family, or any of your clients. But Adler certainly looked at how, if you step back and maybe step out of the stereotypes of the various various things, looking at the different roles that people played in the family. So if you work with families, if you're familiar with family systems theories, there are many family therapists who do a lot of just looking at the family constellation. What was the role of each of the parents and each of the kids, and how do those fit together in terms of complementarity? And so Adler's looking at all of this to understand a person's view of life, how they interpret life, and how your role and place in the family affects, what's going on in your life today and just your default interpretation of the world around you. Now, this is a very interesting intervention. So one of the things Adlerians assess, is what they call early recollections. And so Adler believed that whatever your first memories often are very significant and kind of templating your beliefs about life, about others, about your value as a human. So he would ask clients, what are some of your first memories? And those first memories he thought were very, very important in terms of shaping who you become, shaping your worldview. And oftentimes, this is where some of the basic mistakes or cognitive distortions come from, are these earliest recollections. So it's really, I think, a very unique and fascinating concept. And then we have the basic mistakes. I think many of us will understand this. Again, it's a little bit of an awkward phrasing or translation. Of course, he worked all in German, not in English. Um, but basic mistakes kind of come down to faulty beliefs about yourself, life, and others. And so it's a lot of where this assessment focuses, and all of these things kind of go into, can we give, language to some of these basic mistakes? Some of them are, and again, this language comes very familiar to us from cognitive therapy, which of course came many, many decades after Adler, but overgeneralizing. So, because, for example, I'm bad in one area, I'm bad in all areas. So that's the overgeneralizing. Cognitive therapists talk about this as well. Wanting false or impossible goals of security. So, wanting, 100% guarantee that the person you love will never leave you or will always approve of you or your parents will always approve of you, but just wanting more security out of life than is possible. Um, so misperception of life and its demands, so having very unrealistic expectations of yourself, of life, how it should go, how hard it should be, how hard it shouldn't be, what's fair, what's not. So these are some of the misperceptions of life and life's demands. Minimizing or denial of one's own basic worth. So just feeling like you are just not worthy. So this sense of inferiority, the inferiority complex. So these are some of the the common themes with the basic mistakes. Yeah, and just faulty values. So maybe in this case, it could be valuing money over, connection to other humans. And certainly from Adler's perspective, that sense of having community is going to give you a lot more mental health than just having material things. And in general, in most cases, the research, I would say, supports that. So when you're doing the lifestyle assessment, you're looking at the parenting style, the family constellation, birth order, the person's role in the family, looking at some of their earliest memories, and then trying to see how these themes come together in terms of basic mistakes that are affecting them today. They looked at a physical weak point, or what I guess is translated from the German to organ inferiority is the literal translation. But are there any physical, chronic health issues or other issues, physical issues that contribute to their style of life? That is some things that they also look at. So I love this one. And actually, you will see this question reposed in many forms over the decades and other approaches as well. So the question is something that Adlerian therapists use to assess the underlying purpose or need for the symptom. So this is what's the purpose of the symptom? If you're familiar with systemic therapy, they look at this a lot. But the question is, so what would be different in your life if you didn't have this problem? So this can help you. We talk about secondary gains sometimes in various approaches. And so this is Adler's way of kind of assessing what would be different in your life if you didn't have the problem? So looking at, so for example, if someone's depressed, right, often someone in the family system is picking up slack for them. For example, if you've got a teen who's depressed, oftentimes the parents will be, pushing less maybe on the chores or other life tasks, that sort of thing. So what are the secondary gains of having the symptom? And from a systemic perspective, sometimes a secondary gain could be someone else in the family does that. So in family therapy, we look a lot at, is it possible that a child who's having acting out symptoms, part of the reason for that is the parents, who would otherwise be fighting, kind of work together to stabilize the out of control, the child who's acting out, they work as a team. So in that sense, even though they're in trouble, the family system is more stable and they feel more of security in the family staying together. None of that's conscious. So, so what would be different? It may or may not be conscious. So people are often, or in fact, most of the time, I would say people are not fully conscious of the secondary gain they might be getting, especially when you look at across family systems. But this is a question. And so you would always know that this is a hypothesis, right? This is pretend you're holding this tentatively as a hypothesis, as one of the like silent reinforcers of the problem symptom. So you're not doing this to blame people or judge people or shame people. It's like, for example, if a kid's acting out holds the couple together, and let me tell you, I didn't believe that hypothesis until I did a couple years of my first couple years being working with families. I'm like, wow, that happens more than you would think, right? So, but it isn't like the therapist determines this unilaterally or judging people. It's more like this hypothesis. And could it be that this secondary gain is some of why it's so hard to get unstuck? So just want to throw that out there. So one of the other areas of conceptualization in Adlerian approach is the psychodynamic formulation is what they call it. So so they look at so this is kind of like a kind of broader approach to life. The basic mistakes are kind of very specific, and this is a kind of just broader thing. So the encouraged person, remember encouragement is one of their main things, is someone who has a can-do attitude, and they take needed action without worrying about what would think about them. They do what they need to do. They are kind of the go-getters, and they can do that with confidence. So the goal is always to become an encouraged person in this approach. Then you have people with neurotic symptoms. So neurotic symptoms are anxiety and depression, but they're the kind of garden variety mental health issues in this sense that they're not psychosis, they're not a personality disorder, basically. You're attached to reality, okay? But any other type of symptoms. So this is a yes, but attitude. So I would take action if only I didn't have this problem. So, and Adler saw this as using the symptoms to do what they want to avoid social interest while still receiving social approval. So my symptom is a problem. So you can look at this as someone with either depression or anxiety who may not be doing their full half to contribute socially in their relationships, in their community, but still getting social approval. You're kind of getting a pass because you've got this issue. Then you have a person with psychotic symptoms. He saw this as escapist attitude, living in a fantasy to escape life's actual demands. And this is kind of, you're just saying, no, I will not participate in this charade of society. Charade is probably too strong of a term. I'm trying to step into their worldview, but it's like I'm opting out. I'm not going to work with your reality, and I'm just opting out. And so psychosis is really a reality of one. Is a good way to think of psychosis. So this is kind of how this is conceptualized here. And then finally, people with personality disorders, it's my way or the highway attitude, trying to convince everyone else that your way is right, regardless of what others want or evidence to the contrary. And pretty much they will cooperate if you use their rules. And so I think we all very familiar with people like that. So this is another part of the conceptualization, and the ultimate goal is to get everyone to be an encouraged person who will take action when necessary, that is needed without overly worrying about what other people are thinking or trying to live for approval of others. Uh, as one of as was common in the late 1800s, dream analysis was certainly some part of Adlerian work. But unlike Freud, he really believed that the meaning was unique to each dreamer. So Freud was much more into certain objects and certain scenes and events meant, an objective reality. This is where Adler was so ahead of his time. Adler is saying, no, this is subjective. Each person can have different, the objects can have different meanings in each person's, world or dream. So much more individualistic, kind of looking at the basic mistake often to inform the interpretation of the dream. And then he also looked at what he called these life tasks. So assessing social interests across all 6 areas. So looking at how well they are functioning in terms of social interest, in terms of work, community, love relationships, self-acceptance, spirituality, and parenting. So looking at their ability to be each person, your ability to not just have social interests, we often think of that as the community piece, but looking at it in all spheres of life. So let's look at goal setting in Adlerian counseling and psychotherapy. So the basic long-term goal is to promote courage. I think courage is such a beautiful word because I also think so much of our suffering in life really does come down to a failure of courage. So I love this. The courage to develop social interests, the courage to be socially engaged, to give, receive, to have that back and forth, and to really be an active contributor in all areas of your life, all spheres of life, feeling free to give to others, knowing that you get a lot back in return when you engage that way. So it's courage to develop social interest. And so there is a very much a wellness, positive psychology, social interest kind of focus here. So it's more than just alleviating symptoms. Again, this is where Adler's just so ahead of his time. Every time I go through this, but there is this really thriving. So it's wanting you to thrive in all areas of life is truly the vision and goal in Adlerian. So in the early phase, you're looking at addressing any of the initial crisis or major symptoms. And so in the working phase, you're of course reducing symptoms related to the problem while increasing social interest and social functioning in all life tasks, especially those related to the problem. And then in the late phase, you're increasing social interest in all the other, in all areas of life. And so really creating a kind of robust functioning in all of the 6 areas of life. So let's go ahead and look at what intervention looks like in Adlerian counseling and psychotherapy. So they did homework again. Oh my goodness. When you think of this in the late 1800s with what Freud was doing, right? And even Jung, homework. So, so clearly, I think cognitive behavioral therapists can track their roots back here. But it's just fascinating that usually he doesn't get a lot of credit for this. But so they did. So there was psychoeducation. You're providing clients with psychological information to help them change their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But he gave them tasks to complete between sessions. And they can be things like calling in a strange relative, going on a date, writing a list of fears, writing a list of evidence for and against it, identifying friends that you could reconnect with, finding ways each day to be thankful for your spouse. So there's homework that is given on a weekly basis in this approach to really translate that insight into action. Oops. Oh, there we go. So then another type of intervention that is used in this approach is called interpretation of symptoms. And this is where the counselor interprets the purpose of the symptom to provide insight into their situation. So, it's very purpose focused. So you're focusing on the goal of the behavior. So if the symptom might be anxiety, let's say, so let's look at the purpose of that potential anxiety. So, and you're offering your interpretation in a very tentative way. So, it could be, let's say that, the anxiety is related to really wanting to get approval from an authority figure. Maybe because after doing your lifestyle assessment, you had a highly critical parent, right? So the anxiety is just trying to get everyone's approval because you never got your critical father's approval or critical mother's approval, whatever it was. And the clinician is very open to revision, encouraging the client to rephrase or correct how you're phrasing it. And and the interpretation is really going to have an overtone of being encouraging, right? And of positivity and looking at strength. And so if you have someone who's kind of anxiously trying to please everyone, you know, you can talk about how, some of the benefits you can talk about in a way that's very pathologizing or in a way that is humanizing. Because we all want, it really feels good, I would say, to have the external validation of others feels great. It's wonderful. I think it's hard to find someone who doesn't like it. And the problem with it is that you then become, right, they're beholden to that. And then you're morphing yourself twisting yourself to do whatever you need to do to get that approval. There certainly is a point where that's not good for you. And so you would talk about this in strength-oriented ways and compassionate, empathetic ways to help them, look at this pattern, understand where it came from, look at how it's playing out today, and what could you do differently um, to reduce the anxiety that goes with trying to please everyone in your life. And then also there are what they call self-concept statements. And so these are statements that the client makes that reveals about how they see themselves. So you look at inferiority based self-statements. So this is where just feeling less, inferior to others. And similarly, there's inadequate, just you're not good enough in XYZ area, right? I'm just not good enough overall. Where inferiority is more of a comparison, inadequate is just not enoughness. And then there's guilt-based self-statements. So looking at, when you're talking with clients and the issues in their lives, you're listening for these negative self-statements where I'm just never good enough for my partner, I was never good enough for my parent. Um, Looking at how you may be comparing themselves to siblings and then comparing themselves to, coworkers later in life. So you're looking for these sorts of patterns, these sorts of self-statements. They do challenging and reframing of the basic mistakes in private logic. I mean, again, this is straight up cognitive therapy, which came almost, I would say, 7 decades later, approximately. I have to do the math. I'd have to go look at some of the numbers and publications on that, but just so ahead of his time is all I can say. But this is when you're challenging the logic or realism of a person's kind of private logic and gently reframing it, to be more useful. So here's an example. The upside of worrying is that you tend to be good with details, but is this worrying really serving you? Is it, I often will refer to the ability to be hyper worried about details as a superpower. And so does this, situation truly warrant your superpower that wears you out? So you can only use this, superpower being hyper, attentive to detail and really kind of 100% on for a limited number of things in your life. You can't do it in every area, or you're going to become, obsessive compulsive or burn out or what, so this perfectionism, you only use it, it's a superpower. You can use it in a few places. Where are we going to use it in your life and where are we going to let things slide? So challenging a person's logic and in a supportive way, though, not in that's an irrational thought. You're not doing it in that sort of way, but a very encouraging way, a positive reframe ways to help motivate them. And then you're also looking and leveraging natural and logical consequences. So whenever possible, you're gonna like let life correct their basic mistakes, their mistaken beliefs, or let's see, if your assumption about X, Y, or Z, or, you don't need to study. I'm just thinking of kids here. If you work in teen, the natural consequence of like not studying or not planning, how do things actually go? So you would go ahead and challenge that gently or see how, letting that happen. Right now, I'm a mother of a 16 and 12-year-old. And I work with a lot of teens and adults, and I just had a new intake, so I've got adolescents on the mind right now. But and I was these parents were asking me this week about, so what tips do you have? Because their child's gotten into a lot of kind of problematic things, and along with many others, one of them is, if school or their social network is going to give them feedback, right, on natural consequences to their behaviors, let the school do it, let their friends do it, right? um Let the natural consequences, logical consequences play out, and organize things in that way. And so where you can, allowing that to happen, helping connect the dots for clients, in terms of what their choice they make and what outcome they get, and really clearly linking those things up. So things like, let's say not prioritizing, their studying, ends up with lower grades, or choosing friends who get, who do kind of edgy things, I'll just say, can get you in a lot of trouble at school. So yeah, so these were, natural consequences of, this was, peers were kind of getting this person to do some things that got her into a lot of trouble. And of course, the person who told her to do these crazy things didn't get in trouble. So just looking at all of those, connecting those dots, talking about that with people and helping them figure out how to make better choices in the future. Okay, two of my favorites. I mean, come on, spitting on the soup. It's a great language there. So the anti-suggestion is actually the first paradoxical technique. I know Paul Václavic and a lot of the family therapists really get credit for this. They used it a lot, probably why it's such a signature move in early family therapy approaches. But the anti-suggestion is a type of paradoxical technique, and it's kind of prescribing. And they can be used inside session and out of session. So what you're doing is you're suggesting the client, actually engage and exaggerate the symptom. And so what's really fascinating is whatever the symptom is, if you exaggerate it 10%, um, people often can see that. So let's say you have a parent who worries a lot, is a helicopter parent, right? Worrying about their kid all the time. If you try to logically, contradict, like we were talking on the last slide, talk logically to them, look at some of the natural consequences, and that doesn't change anything. They're still kind of helicopter parent. So when you suggest that they exaggerate and become more worried by another 10, 20%, and more helicoptering go on, maybe that's what needs to happen. What's weird is that that helps them see how exaggerated some of the other areas are. It's just human psychology. I can't explain it, but I promise you, it's one of the techniques I use when kids are being bullied. Sometimes one of the things, I'll have them try is take whatever the bully is saying and exaggerate it 10, 20%, agree with it, take it on, And there's this weird thing where you kind of lean into that logic. All of a sudden the bully has to, like, they don't know what to do. They're kind of flummoxed. So it's weird. Any type of kind of faulty line of thinking, when you take it and exaggerate it a bit, that for sometimes that's going to be the easiest way for someone to let go of that kind of faulty thinking. And then spitting in the soup. This is a fun one. Even the name is fun, huh? It just refers to making the overt covert in terms of the benefits or hidden power of having a particular symptom. And you only want to do this when you're pretty sure that this is a dynamic that's really going on. And that goes back to the question that we talked about earlier. That's looking at, what's one benefit of depression that, you know, so here's an example here saying, one side benefit of being depressed is that no one's asking you to do your chores anymore. Everyone's lowered their standards of what they expect out of you because you've now been labeled as depressed. You're on this medication. And I've seen this with a lot of teenagers, right? They get an ADHD identity or label or diagnosis, depression, or and so you don't want to do this if you think it's, truly medical, but it's something to look at when you think that this would be useful to a given client. So you're not going to use spitting in the soup with all your clients. But it's when, I've seen it sometimes with adolescents. You can see it in marriages sometimes too, as well, or in family dynamics where having this problem kind of gets some be side benefits and a kind of a pass, right? And you would use this when it's clinically appropriate, because clearly, if someone's got severe ADHD and we're really trying to manage it on medication, and it's not managed, this is not the time to use that technique. But there are other times where you will see it would make sense. This approach is also used with couples. So you begin kind of step one, phase one is really ensuring everyone feels heard and understood. Then you help each person understand their partner's, their own and their partner's style of lifestyle. So those beliefs, those basic mistakes, what their family constellations were like, and how that affects how they're seeing their partner, experiencing things in the relationship. Again, giving them insight, right, both into their own dynamics and that of their partner. You can see how this is paralleling individual treatment. And then finally, they call reorientation, but finding new actions and alternatives to the problem behaviors for the couple. And I know we're coming close to the end of time, so I will keep moving forward here with research and the evidence base. This Adlerian is actually used in what's called the systematic training for effective parenting. This is a major parenting program that's been around for many decades. It's a positive parenting approach, encouragement, right? Uses encouragement, appreciation, motivation to improve child behaviors and parent-child relationships. It's one of the major evidence-based approaches. And then really briefly here looking at some of the applications with diversity, that there are a lot of modern feminist and multicultural values, the egalitarian relationship, right? That's pretty revolutionary for Adler's time, but social interest, looking at inferiority and superior themes of inferiority and superiority, other isms, looking at spirituality, a sense of connection with something bigger, looking at social factors also impacting mental health and how that whole social network, your sense of community, your sense of connection to community is so important. And so there's a lot of themes here that really align with very contemporary approaches in mental health. They do develop and monitor the counseling relationship with diverse clients to make sure that there is a fit and that what you're doing is really makes sense and fits for the client and their worldview, being very sensitive and attending to that. And then also just looking at the larger, broader cultural dynamics that can be unique when you're marginalized, and attending to that is part of how they adapt Adlerian approach to working with diverse clients. And so just to kind of wrap up here, so social interest is really defines mental health and what it means to be mentally healthy from an Adlerian perspective, which is really unique and extremely revolutionary for the time of history he was writing in. But it's this ability to have these deep, rich social connections. And so the flip side of that, and what keeps us from having this real connection with ourselves, with our loved ones, with our community, is a sense of inferiority. And really, Adler would say that's the source of all of our mental health issues, our mental health problems. And so this is kind of what you're looking at it as a practitioner in this approach of addressing those areas where a person doesn't feel worthy, doesn't feel good enough, is, seeking external approval, and looking for those basic mistakes to really help them, identify these, work through these, and come up with more, accurate, valid ways. And through encouragement is really what the process is about. So many things, I would say, in this approach really are just so relevant for the 21st century. It's hard for me to really think of an approach that just has weathered history, weathered time as well as this approach has. So we are coming up on the hour. Those of you attending live, I just posted your link in the chat. Um, if you need to get your if you need a letter of attendance, and I'm going to go ahead now and take a couple of questions in the Q&A for those who are attending live. So, this is a great question. Medya is asking, how effective would you say giving clients homework is? Okay, so if you have any of my textbooks, you'll see in all the cognitive behavioral therapy chapters where I go into the most about homework. I give my own unique Diane Gehart spiel on homework because, yeah, most of the homework we give clients, they don't do. And so there's a real art to assigning homework and making it happen. And so most of that has to do with doing it very small, making sure you take at least 10, 20 minutes to figure out exactly how they're going to do it, identify all the roadblocks, and to really figure out how to make that happen. There is a video, if you have the ebook for any of my books, for one of my cognitive therapy, where I have working with a teenager who wants to do 5 minutes of mindfulness before school. He has ADHD, wanting to reduce his medications. And it's just a great example of how hard it is to assign homework, because where we end up is that he's going to have to go to bed 30 minutes early to do 5 minutes of mindfulness realistically before he goes to school. So, and you can see we spent almost probably half an hour or more just talking about what the sleep schedule is, what the wake up thing is, how he gets along with his mom, and of course, trying to not have her nag him because we don't want her nagging him. So it really takes a long time to assign homework in a way that's going to work for people so that they do it. That said, I have also done research studies that talk, and one of my on how clients experience therapy and the process of change. And I'll never forget one of my people I interviewed said when I was a couple of people or several people I was interviewing, this was a theme that came up when I was doing my qualitative interviews for my dissertation for my doctorate. And I was just so blown away by this. They're like, well, I remember this one woman and she said, um, my therapist assigns good homework assignments, but I rarely do them, but they're helpful anyway. I'm like, oh, do tell. Tell why, please. We want to know why you don't do the homework we work so hard to assign you. And she said, what happened? So she was a single mom, 5-year-old kid. She was working. She'd pick up her kid. She'd come home. She'd be tired. And the daughter, of course, wants to play and engage with her mom. And she was just too tired and she'd be snapping at the daughter. And so they had this tension going on, right? And so the therapist, I think, said, well, what if you come home and you let her watch a show for 15 minutes and you take 15 minutes to relax? And they came up with a little relaxation routine and then you guys connect. And she said, I never did it, but she said, when I would walk in the door, I would think about doing the routine. And then I would say, I don't feel like doing that. I can just be chill with my daughter and not be barking orders at her and being irritable. So she said I never needed to do the homework because it just shifted how I saw what was happening and it was easier just to adopt the new behavior. So that is a very long-winded story as to what you can do with how homework works and isn't effective. It's very hard to assign it well. I remember the first time I looked at Albert Ellis as a thought record, right? And it had, I don't know, 8 steps to it to counter negative thoughts. And I just looked at that and it's supposed to be homework. And I just laughed. I'm like, oh, my clients would never do that. So there's an art to assigning homework. That said, sometimes just the idea of what they could be doing differently as homework can end up being helpful. Okay. So I can't post slides on YouTube. I am working on getting a course together with the slides, so I will be working on getting that to you as well. Which postmodern mirrors? I wouldn't say postmodernism. I mean, the only place. So the question here is which postmodern theory mirrors Adlerian conceptualization style? I don't know if I would say there is one that mirrors it. But there is a little bit of starting to look at the identity narrative in Adlerian that is interesting. There's a connection there to postmodern. But I would say Adlerian has really got a lot of the roots of humanistic psychotherapy and cognitive psychotherapy. It's clear. I mean, the interventions are really the same. He doesn't get credit in humanistic, but postmodern is, I would say, a little more evolved than some of this. Although the identity narrative, that concept of the story we tell ourselves about who we are, is very clear in Adlerian, and you will see that in narrative as well. Okay, so Megan is just saying I assign homework with most of my clients, and she introduces it to be upfront and tell them I assign it, and then I explain to them, you know, that this is where I'm gonna go next, so they don't want to be caught off guard. So yeah, so there are ways to do homework. There is an art, and I think all of us need to find our way to do that. I love it. She says most of the time they do it because she just advertises up front. You're going to get homework from me, and then in the next session, I'm going to ask you how it goes, how it went. And so she gets her clients doing homework that way. Thank you, Megan, for sharing that. That's great. And most of the time they do it. Fred is saying homework can be shaming. It shouldn't be. I would say you need to be careful how you do it, and there's an art to doing it well, and so it shouldn't be shaming. And like I said, I have done research and discovered that for many clients, they don't homework's useful even if they don't do it for some clients. So there's also that to remember. Um, Awesome. Kyle is saying, yeah, first year MFT student makes you excited to delve deeper into Adler. And I don't have Adler in my family therapy books or only my counseling ones just because I ran out of space and it's not usually on the national exam. So that is kind of where that is. So, okay. Oh, someone is saying the letter has the wrong date on it. Oh, well, you know what is really cool, I have to say, about modern technology is that I can update the text of that letter as I am talking here. So I will going to go ahead and fix that really quickly. At least hopefully it has the right title, it sounds like. So I will do that real quick here. Um, okay. What other type of questions do we have coming in? Questions or comments? I got another one here. Oh, yes. Okay. I will be fixing, okay. So Senna is asking an interesting question. How similar is the Adler's question to the miracle question? It's actually, I would say it's pretty different in the sense the miracle question is really trying to get someone to identify and step into what their life would look like. So the miracle, let me step back. The miracle question, for those of you who don't know, comes from solution focused therapy. And it looks at let's see. I'm getting the date real quick here. Of course. It's trying to get the client to step into a future without the problem. And so it's really helping you identify what the goal is of treatment and also trying to get them just to envision that. And so where this one is more looking at trying to identify secondary gains. So that's the real, so it's really different. So Adler's question is looking at what are the things keeping this symptom going, where the miracle question is really looking for what is life going to look like when things are done. So you're looking at goal setting, you're looking at behaviors that need to be targeted, and what they're and defining really the goals for treatment. So I think they're pretty different. Those of you who we're trying to get the letter. I updated the date on the letter. And so if you go and put your name in again, which you can, in that link, you will get hopefully an updated letter. So let me know if that works better for you. Okay. So we have a question here. Tyler's asking, do people with neurotic symptoms tend to overthink? That is probably the most common version of neuroticism is overthinking. You can be ruminating, you can be overanalyzing. Projecting all the most of the defense mechanisms in psychodynamic like projection, all that stuff would be considered neurotic. So and then if so, how can a clinician combat these symptoms to bring the client to encouragement? And so that's where you're going to be looking at a lot of it's a great question, Tyler. Thank you. Because you're looking then at all of the basic mistakes that lead them to overthink, right? Because often it might be, I have to be perfect to be good enough, could be a basic mistake belief if you had a highly critical parent. Most people have some variation thereof of that belief. So you'd be looking at that belief, trying to counter it with logic, those sorts of things, and using encouragement to have them maybe try new behaviors to see you don't have to be perfect to be liked, right? Or whatever it might be. So yeah, so you would be working with the basic mistakes a lot and identifying those, looking at how they inform some of the quote unquote neurotic behaviors. Again, we're using language from the late 1800s. We use that term a lot less now, but you would be identifying the basic mistakes, working through them, and helping them, encouraging them to try new things, encouraging them to be more gentle in how they judge themselves and others. So, okay. Yes, so Ned is asking, aren't some dreams spiritual, a replay of daily life, and some psychologically, depending on the owner and the meaning? Adler would agree with you on that one. Yes. Um, and Jung would say they are archetypal. Freud would, had more specific meanings for a lot of things. So that sort of thing. So asking how would he treat a suicidal client? Very using this approach, you would be looking at what are the basic mistakes, probably have to do around their worth, right? Feeling inferior is usually a very common theme. Um, but you would look at what is the basic mistake that is making them feel like their life can't get better, right? What are those beliefs that are fueling the sense that everything is hopeless? And then using encouragement to have them take action to make changes in their life. So you'd use this exact same process with someone who is suicidal. Trauma informed. Well, I mean, trauma informed is something that is really a 21st century term. And I mean, Adler certainly didn't have the research that usually trauma informed is looking at applying some of our current scientific knowledge from the 21st century to working with clients and understanding how trauma works. You can certainly use this approach in a trauma informed way. Um, so, okay. Very good. Okay, there we go. Did he work with dreams? It seems he turned from the unconscious to lived experience. Is Fred's comment? And I would agree with you there, Fred, because I mean, dream analysis is part of what he did, but I think it's less central. Where I think Freud was definitely he was 100% of the time in the working with the subconscious mind, maybe not 100%, but he worked a lot there. That's his main focus. Where Adler said both social life and the interior world are important. So Adler certainly spent less time doing dream analysis, you know, on average, I guess every client could be different than Freud typically would have or Freudian would because there's so much emphasis on social life as well as the inner world. Okay. 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 Okay, so I'm reading this up. So there's a comment here in Adlerian theory, therapists often use techniques like early recollections and family constellation to understand the client's lifestyle. Can you explain how we should apply these tools in practice? So this is, when you're assessing clients, right? You can certainly go and ask for their first memory. And also just, I spend a lot of time with most of my clients, whether it's in, individual or family work, what were their early family experiences like? What was their role in their, family like? Relationship with siblings, relationship with each parent. So really getting a good understanding of that family dynamic, because that really does inform our lens for interpreting life as we get older. So yeah, so I think you would use it in very much the same way that we've been talking about. Um, so people are talking about if you have a secure attachment, will you still have an inferiority complex? So I have trouble with how something has slipped into how we talk about attachment, where I feel like, are you securely attached or you're not? I think that binary is often talked, are you securely attached? Are you anxiously attached? Are you avoidantly attached? Are you, secure anxious? It's like, for research purposes, yeah, they've got to label people for research purposes. But for clinical, for those of us who are doing psychotherapy, I think what you're going to find when you talk to people, when you work with people, I work with a lot of couples and families, right? So the question is, how long? I think of it more on a spectrum. How much relational stress can you be under before you flip into anxious or avoidant or some other, unhealthy attachment style? So it's not so much are you securely attached or not, but it's, at what point do you slip into feeling anxious or avoidant or some variation thereof, insecurely attached? And so I think the people who get labeled, on a research study as securely attached can handle a fair amount of tension in a relationship before they start acting out to, in an anxious or avoidant way. So that's how I think of secure attachment. So sure, you can certainly be so as someone who tends to score as securely attached, will have less inferiority complex than someone who is anxiously attached or avoidantly attached. So I would put all of those concepts on a spectrum because under different circumstances, different contexts, we all are a little bit different. So I hope that helps. Okay. Okay. Looks like there are a couple more comments or questions coming in. I'm gonna check in on those. Okay. Oh no, they said that's so weird because I thought this was fixed yesterday. Someone is saying that the letter isn't quite um working right. So let me go ahead and double fix that. My apologies if that was not uh I thought I had someone fix that and I thought I looked okay. But we can always fix that. So my apologies. Um okay. You're right. That's so weird. You know what? It takes multiple clicks sometimes to get things right. Okay. Sorry about that. So go ahead and try that again. Very good. So it should all look right if you were trying to get the letter. My apologies for that. For those of you who are attending live. Okay. Any other questions? Comments? Wow, I got third. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Hey. Sarah's been looking forward to this all week. I am, uh, yeah, I'm glad this seems to resonate with so many of you. Okay. Okay. Awesome, awesome. Okay. Very good, everyone. Well, it looks like everyone got their got their questions answered. I'm going to one more time for those of you attending live. I will go ahead and put this in the chat, but I am glad so many of you enjoyed this, enjoyed learning about Adler because I don't know, I just feel like he was it's just miraculous to me how far ahead of his time he was, how the seeds of so many different theoretical models are really in his work from the late 1800s. I don't think anyone gives him nearly enough credit for what he did because it's got very clear roots to the, what we call humanistic existential approaches, as well as the cognitive therapy approaches. And it's just, and it's just such a positive, uplifting, and it's incredible that his work still speaks so beautifully to the 21st century, 150 years later, as I go through this, about, inferiority complexes and encouragement, social interest. I'm like, the whole time I'm like thinking of all my adolescent clients where this is exactly what they need 150 years later. It's exactly what they need. So it really was an incredible really very incredible man, well ahead of his time. So I hope you feel inspired. I hope you feel encouraged. And I am so glad you joined me. And I will be posting the sessions for the links for next month's registration here as I'm getting my fall semester sessions calendared, but you will get an announcement in the next few weeks or next week or so with all of the listings for the fall. And like I said, I am beginning to re-record all of the lectures that go with my counseling theory textbooks. It's going to take about another year and a half to get them all done when I do one a month, but we will make it through. So if you stay on my mailing list, you will be updated, and this will be live on YouTube in the coming week. Okay. So be well, everyone, and take care. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a beautiful weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.